This is really my pleasure now to introduce Carl Greenfield from the IEA. I spent many years working in the International Energy Agency, so I feel it's my sort of home. And even though we never overlapped, now we're sharing sort of the same foster care, I guess. So Carl is a policy analyst at the International Energy Agency. He works on legal, regulatory, and policy issues of the carbon capture, utilization, and storage in the CCUS team at the IEA. And he also works with emerging economies like India and Indonesia on CCS and with the Clean Energy Ministerial. So it's a pleasure to have Carl with us and IEA messages. I think many of us, probably most of us here, cite IEA very often when we want to talk about CCS and the role of CCS in climate mitigation, role of CCS in BECCS and DUCs, the cost, the needed investment. So we all cite IEA. So here we have a first-hand source of information. So Carl will make a short presentation, and then I'll ask him a couple of questions, and then we'll open up for the audience to ask questions. So Carl, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, can you all hear me? Well, good. It's a jarring sensation to see your face directly popped up at yourself. But good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second half of the Europe Forum on CCUS. As the first speaker post-lunch, I have the unique pleasure to keep you all awake and well-informed. As Ellina noted, my name is Carl Greenfield, and I'm with the International Energy Agency. And today I'll be talking about the role of CCUS in achieving net zero emissions by mid-century, some of the trends that we're seeing within the industry, as well as some things we can do to get us where we need to be. The IEA has consistently highlighted the importance of CCUS to fully decarbonize the energy system. Excluding CCUS from the portfolio of decarbonization options not only makes it more difficult, but also more costly to achieve climate targets. In summary, we see the value of CCUS as fourfold. The first is that CCUS can be retrofitted to existing power and industrial facilities. This allows for their continued operation while also avoiding the early costly retirement of valuable assets. This is an incredibly important aspect of a smooth and just energy transition, given that the average age of fossil assets in power and industry in some regions is very young. In Asia, for example, the average age of coal-fired power plants is only 13 years old, and new plants are continually to be built. Second, CCUS can tackle emissions from hard-to-abate sectors, where technology options are limited or less mature. For example, CCUS is virtually the only technology solution for deep emissions reductions from cement production. It's also the most cost-effective approach in many regions to curb emissions from iron and steel, chemicals manufacturing. And captured CO2 is one of the building blocks to make synthetic fuels, one of the limited number of low-carbon options for long-distance transport, such as aviation. Third, CCUS is an enabler of low-emissions hydrogen production and hydrogen-based fuel production, which can support the decarbonization of other parts of the energy system, such as industry and transport. And finally, CCUS can provide removal options for emissions that can't be avoided or reduced directly by combining it with bioenergy, BECCS, as well as direct air capture and storage, also known as DACs. So where are we today, and where do we need to go? This figure shows capture capacity by sector and operation, planned for 2030, and what's needed for 2030 in our net zero emission scenario. I see many of you taking pictures here, and I highly encourage that. The one caveat is that right now we're actually updating our net zero modeling, and so these numbers are the most up-to-date numbers, but this is going to change in probably the next 3-4 months. So continue to take pictures, but just a tiny caveat that these numbers may in fact change. So what we see is around 40 commercial CCUS facilities are in operation today, with the collective capacity to capture around 45 million tons of CO2 each year. This needs to increase to 1.2 billion tons per year in 2030. The scale-up is very important. In fact, on average, our net zero scenario requires more than 10 new CCUS-equipped facilities to be commissioned each month between now and 2030. There is some promise If all advanced projects that are currently in the pipeline take FID in line with their current schedules, global CCUS spending could reach above $30 billion in 2025. This is up from the around $3 billion USD that we see today. And as we saw from Jared's presentation earlier this morning, it's actually just a fraction of where we need to be. This dramatic potential ramp-up reflects the extent to which the project pipeline has grown recently. And while there's been significant momentum in deployment in recent years, the pipeline still needs to grow from what it's currently at to where we need to be by 2030. The scale-up is even more important in 2050, where CCUS reaches 6.2 billion tons per year in the net zero scenario. Beyond scale, capture capacity also needs to diversify from a majority of natural gas processing, what we see today, to facilities for hydrogen-based fuel production, industrial facilities and power, and of course removals. The project pipeline indicates that we're improving in this diversification, but more efforts are needed, particularly within industry. Now, the deployment levels are nice. I love deployment levels. They're relatively easy to remember by a certain date, 1.2 by 2030, 6.2 by 2050. Don't commit these to memory. But when we start to peel back these numbers and talk about how to get there, it's really a conversation about infrastructure deployment. In addition to the capture facility, infrastructure for CO2 management also includes CO2 transport and storage facilities. Once captured, the CO2 can be used on site or transported by pipeline or ship, either to a point of use or for permanent underground storage. The deployment of CO2 transport and storage infrastructure accelerates pretty rapidly in our net zero scenario. There's a substantial expansion of CO2 transport infrastructure in our net zero scenario in the form of CO2 pipeline networks, but also the CO2 shipping fleet, port infrastructure for CO2 handling as well. The global aggregate pipeline length would need to increase from around 9,500 kilometers today to between 30 and 50,000 kilometers by 2030. And some of this capacity is also used to transport CO2 to and within ports for shipping. When we start to peel back the layers of CO2 management infrastructure, we see that it also requires a lot of materials. Though unlike other clean energy technologies, such as batteries for EVs or solar and wind installations, material demand or critical mineral demand is unlikely really to be a major constraint to CCUS deployment of projects. For example, CO2 pipelines and shipping rely heavily on steel. We know this. CO2 infrastructure relies heavily on cement. We know this. However, the demand of these materials from pipelines and storage infrastructure is really negligible compared to our current global annual production. So what's really the constraint? Well, we see that lead times, the amount of time it takes to actually build a project, are actually likely to be a major constraint in deploying CO2 infrastructure. Globally, very few potential CO2 storage resources have been declared technically and economically feasible to store CO2. This is not because of a lack of resources or a lack of geology, but rather due to a lack of data. Subsurface data collection takes time and it's very expensive. Even after the storage resource has been identified, it can take anywhere from 4 to 10 years to build that storage facility. For pipelines, lead times for new CO2 pipelines are typically around 6 to 9 years. Even though this is similar to what we see in the oil and gas industry, without addressing these long lead times for CCUS projects, we run the risk of falling behind on our short-term deployment targets. Fortunately, recent changes to CCUS business models may allow for specialization along the CCUS value chain in order to target deployment. With a few exceptions, most CCUS projects to date have operated on the same business model. They're full chain projects where CO2 is transported from one capture facility to one injection site, typically involving a single operator. What we're seeing now is the breakup of the CCUS value chain. And I think it's evidenced actually by the amount of stakeholders in this room from different parts of that value chain. And either it's the capture, the transport, or the dedicated storage side, sometimes in connection with emerging shared infrastructure for CCUS hubs. In fact, by our count, over 140 CCUS hubs are currently in development. This is more than 3 times as many as what we saw in 2021. Along the CCUS value chain, the most significant growth is really observed in the development of the transport and storage infrastructure. This is particularly true in North America and Europe, but also true in China, the Mideast, and Australia as well. In 2022, over 210 million tons of new dedicated CO2 storage capacity was announced. This is up from 100 million tons in 2021 and 70 million tons in 2020. There are similar capacities for connecting infrastructure, including collection terminals, pipeline and shipping, and these are also starting to enter into planning. So how do we get to where we need to be? We need to take urgent steps to ensure that CCUS is available to contribute to net zero goals. A major ramp up of CCUS deployment is required, especially within this next decade, to put our global energy system on track for net zero emissions by mid-century. Governments here have a critical role to play through policies that establish a sustainable and viable market for CCUS, but industry as well must also embrace this opportunity. No sector will be unaffected by this clean energy transition, and for some, including heavy industry, the value of CCUS is inescapable. The key to successful policy is really designing a framework that supports the creation of this sustainable and viable market for CCUS. There's no one-size-fits-all policy solution, as we've had different sideline conversations here and even in our last panel, but it's really a mix of different instruments that will start to see CCUS really prosper. And for each country, this depends on the local market conditions, this depends on institutional factors. On their own, technology-neutral measures, such as carbon pricing, are truly great, but are generally not sufficient. Measures targeted at specific CCUS applications, including capital grants, operational support, these can start to help build a business case for investment and drive widespread deployment in the near term. We've identified 4 high-level priorities for governments and industry to support a rapid scaling up of CCUS in the next decade. The first is to create the conditions to stimulate private investment. This includes putting a value on reducing emissions. It also includes funding support for capital and operating costs, as well as the efficient allocation of risks across the public and private sectors. The second is to target the development of industrial hubs with shared CO2 infrastructure. This means identifying hub opportunities in industrial regions, as well as establishing the business models for shared CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. We're seeing these developments already within industry, but we're also seeing clear leaders from governments as well starting to think about these different business models. The third is to identify and encourage the deployment of CO2 storage. This not only includes the development of a CO2 storage atlas, but also the enabling frameworks, the legal and regulatory frameworks to ensure safe and secure storage, and importantly, the support of public awareness and public education. And finally, we need to boost innovation to reduce costs and ensure that critical technologies and applications are available. This includes sectors where emissions are hard to abate, as well as for carbon removal. Thanks again. I'm looking forward to the fireside chat and any questions you all might have.
Thank you very much, Carl. I'll ask you just a few questions and then we'll leave it to the audience. We're running a bit late, so please bear with us. So you mentioned that the business models are changing. And in Europe, we see CO2 storage and transport emerging as a service. Do you have any suggestions in terms of policy? Like what could be done on the policy front, what the policymakers could do to accommodate that changing business model for CCS?
Sure. So I see the first main thing is really coordination. And so when we start to talk about hubs and different industrial emitters within the same region, you're talking about cross-sector coordination, industries that don't normally talk to each other. The governments here can play a key role in enabling this coordination and collaboration. We see this in different models, whether that's in the US, whether that's in Canada, whether that's in the UK. The governments are really starting to step up and start to help the coordination across these different industries. A second aspect is really making sure that the laws and regulations, the legal and regulatory frameworks, are in place and are fit for purpose, especially as we start to talk about open access, third-party access. We heard about this in the last panel as well. For example, the CCS directive, although there's a provision for open access, in implementation, it's a little bit more difficult and it's a little bit unclear. So we need to make sure that our existing laws and regulations have it such that when these business models are developing across the value chain, and we see specialized companies wanting to develop storage, wanting to develop transport, that laws and regulations don't act as a barrier, but in fact, they actually support the development of these different business models.
Thank you. And sorry, does it work? Yeah. So I'm also wondering, we talked about, you mentioned the lead time to develop a CCS project. We talked about it in the morning, that it takes 6-7 years sometimes. At the same time, there is this ambitious target for 2030 already. So only 7 years time horizon. Any suggestions what industry and governments can do to speed up the process so that we can see at least something closer to the target set for 2030 in the IEA net zero scenario, in the European goal, and other that we heard from Jared this morning?
Sure, no doubt about it. CCUS projects are large infrastructure projects that cross jurisdictions, that can go across many different stakeholders, whether that's individual residents, whether that's companies, whether that's government property. And so what we really want to see is making sure that we can deploy CCUS projects on time and making sure that these projects are deployed within a meaningful time frame. And so from the government perspective, there's a few things that governments can do. The very first is establishing clear timelines and permitting requirements, giving a signal to those applicants saying, as soon as we receive your application, you're going to hear back from us within this time frame. That's a first easy step that governments can take. Another option, another tool that governments have at their disposal is really designating one regulatory body or regulatory agency to handle the entirety of the permitting process. Not necessarily filling out the applications for you, but making sure that you're hitting the milestones that you need to hit in order to secure your investment, in order to deploy your project on time. And finally, the third aspect that governments can do is starting to build regulatory capacity. We touched on this a little bit this morning, how in the United States, the state of Louisiana has a large number of folks working on CCUS and is able to process permits on time, more so than the federal government of the United States has. So ensuring that the regulator has enough capacity and resources and bandwidth to process the amount of applications is key, because otherwise an application is going to sit on somebody's desk for a long time, and that can inevitably delay a project. For industry, one of the best things that I can recommend is early engagement with the community. We've seen a number of success stories for CCUS projects around the world to where the project developer has proactively reached out to the community, engaged with the community, ran an education campaign, and got early community buy-in so that by the time you start having these discussions of the economic benefits, the ancillary benefits coming from a project, the community is already on board and well informed of what's going to happen. Without this community buy-in, you could run into roadblocks, and we've seen projects run into roadblocks from community opposition. So including the community early on in these discussions is vital.
Thank you. So it sounds like there is responsibility on both the industry and the government to push the projects through so that by 2030 we can demonstrate that CCS is actually working and delivering on its ambition and the role assigned to it.
Exactly.
So everybody should work together, and we only have 7 years to kind of prove that CCS can play that important role, which is very important, especially vis-a-vis public and some of the organizations that are questioning the role of CCS. I guess let's maybe open up for the audience. Yeah, I'll.
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Do I get a mic or can I shout?
I think Dom has a mic.
It's coming.
Here you are, sir. Thanks. Adam, really enjoyed your remarks, and particularly your last comment about the public engagement and community acceptance. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit, what projects have done this well, and what was it that they did that helped, and how do you observe concerns varying around the world in different jurisdictions and so on, just drawing on your own experience? Thank you.
Sure. Do we maybe want to take a couple first, or just?
Yeah, let's see if we have a couple of more questions, so then Carl can take several of them. Any more? I was too optimistic saying that nobody is falling asleep in this group after lunch, but some people are digesting their lunch. Okay, I see Juho, and then the gentleman behind. Yeah.
Thanks, Carl. This one, is it on? Yeah. The paradigm has really shifted from sort of point to point to the hubs and clusters thinking, which makes total sense. But what are your thoughts regarding the following? One of the key industries who needs CCUS is cement. And I think they're typically an industry that is not always in these industrial hubs. They're anywhere where the limestone is, and that can be in the middle of nowhere. And so how do we help that particular industry best going forward, who might not find its happiness in the hubs approach alone? Thanks.
Thank you, Juho. Please go ahead.
Yeah, John Glynn, CRH. A question to you. What right now do you think is the closest to the best model from a risk perspective for all the actors? So we've got the US, we've got the UK, we've got the European broadly with the type of innovation fund supports, and then we've got Norway, which is in the first case highly de-risked the first projects. Where do you see the best assembly of across the chains, an optimized risk model that's going to make it attractive to pile in? Because there's difficulties, particularly in Europe. When you look at the model at the moment, there's difficulty connecting all the pieces to make it very, to bring it to FID. So just a couple of perspectives on that, and we have activity all over the world, so we're encountering this in different places. So your personal view at the moment.
Thank you. Already very good and difficult 3 questions. I think there was another one here, and then we'll turn to you to respond.
Thanks. I was just wondering if the IEA has a view on, so looking at the scale of the infrastructure that is required and sort of needs to be deployed at the rates and scale that's needed. Have you got any sort of comparable deployments of other energy infrastructure that has had to be delivered at such a rate? Because I struggle with trying to sort of really understanding what that pace of delivery looks like. So is there a comparable technology which is deployed at a similar rate, and then maybe you can compare and contrast and go, are we within ballpark of achieving this or are we not? So.
Another very good and difficult question. Okay, the floor is yours. I'm glad I'm not the one responding on behalf of IEA this time, at least.
I'll actually start with that one first. That's a difficult question when it comes to CCUS because it's such a large scale, like I mentioned before, a large scale infrastructure project, and the rapid deployment of large scale projects we really haven't seen. Our closest comparison is really to see how fast the oil and gas industry has been able to ramp up in different countries based off of different market factors or different policy factors. We could use that somewhat as a proxy. It's not a great proxy. It's easier for the smaller scale technologies. It's easier for solar. It's easier for wind because we could start to see, say, the deployment of vaccines. We can see the deployment of cell phones. We have these smaller scale products, but the mass manufactured products, we don't have a direct comparison to that. And so the closest thing we could say is that we do need what we'll call a wartime effort to have an all-hands-on-deck approach to really get this sense of urgency, because for these large-scale projects, it's not just a matter of deploying a lot of things onto the market, but it's ensuring that the large things that we do deploy, when subsidies do phase out, that they're able to be sustained and are able to have a viable business case moving forward. And that kind of goes into maybe the question before that on risks. I think if I had an answer for this, maybe I'd be in a very different point in my life of what's the best policy model. But I think it's actually a combination of factors, because what works in one country, what works in one region, won't work in another region. I know for a fact a very top-down regulatory approach would never work in the United States. But also at the same time, the European Commission is not going to approve tens and tens of billions of dollars to CCUS like this. And so it's really a matter of, as countries and regions start to think about their CCUS policies and sort of really their risk appetite of taking on that risk from the private sector, it's really a matter of looking inward to see what their existing institutional support structures look like, what their existing subsidy schemes look like. And you don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel when it comes to CCUS. CCUS is a clean energy technology that has its own nuances, sure, but you can also benefit from the existing policy schemes within countries in order to sort of smooth the rollout of policies. And so if that means offering large amounts of capital and operating support for projects like we see in the United States to take on that initial investment risk, sure, that could work in the United States. That's not necessarily going to work, let's say, in the Middle East, which has a completely different institutional structure, and it's more the development of CCUS projects are more state-led. In Europe, we just in the last breakout session, we saw a good overview of Europe's approach, which has been really the strategic identification and really the planning aspect. And this is incredibly important when you start to talk about finding the projects that really need to be deployed and doubling down on these projects. But again, as we've heard from in this room, projects also need money. So it's a matter of different aspects and choosing different policy tools that will align with your specific country or align with the specific region. On to Juho's question on cement, that's a very important question because cement plants aren't located where we see these large industrial clusters, and it's difficult for these emitters to really start to become involved in the discussion and conversation and can often be left out. I also understand, Juho, why you're asking this question, because platforms like the one you run, the CCUS initiative, can offer at least a starting point for industries to collaborate across each other. So that's the SEM CCUS initiative to start bringing in different actors, like the cement and concrete industry, for example, and start to have the discussions with CO2 transport and storage operators, but also start to have the discussions with other types of industrial emitters to really start to have the difficult conversations of cost allocation, network planning, and things like this. I think from an industry perspective, having coalitions, whether that's on the capture side or also whether that's on the buyer side, so something like a buyers club for low carbon products. I think having these industry coalitions together with government support is a way to bring in the emitters that may not be involved directly within the industrial hub space. And then finally, to the first question on public perception. Two projects come to mind, Tomokomai in Japan, as well as the Shell Quest project in Canada. These two are really case study examples of how you engage with the community early on in the process. Each project did something different, but from a high level, there was an early educational campaign before the project was even decided that it was going to be financially viable. The company went to the community and talked about different aspects that was important for the community, whether that's the value of CCS in climate mitigation, whether that's job creation, whether that's supporting a technical workforce. Companies were going to these communities early on to start this educational campaign because the communities, for the most part, had no idea what CCS was. And a large project might come into town, and so what does this mean? And so sometimes there was a task force that was developed. In the case of Shell's Quest project, there's an ongoing task force between the community and the developer Shell to continually get community input. And this is after the project was built, as the project is continuing operation, to get that community level input. And there are aspects also that the government can do to become involved with this, whether that's having state and or non-federal and local representatives also be a part of the discussion, or whether that's, depending on the community and the structure, whether that's the national government also coming in and highlighting the importance of this technology for reaching climate goals. I think for each community, it's really going to depend on what's important to them. And so these two are really seen as the shining examples. I think we're seeing a bit of an evolution within this, because these two projects were very specific, but in the US, for instance, we're seeing some public opposition for pipeline development because it goes across multiple people's backyards, multiple jurisdictions, and there's a big conversation of really what's the community benefit to having a pipeline run through your farm. So really, in my view, it's the job of the developer to not only show the economic benefits of a project, of a vast infrastructure project like this, but also any other maybe non-economic or non-tangible benefits that could come from this project. And in the view of a lot of communities, this could involve potential retraining, this could involve partnerships with local schools and other local organizations, and really from the outset getting that public buy-in to make sure that the company or the developer's name is not really seen as this outside entity that's coming in to build this thing and leave, but rather that it can provide some sort of tangible benefits. So these are some of the themes that we've seen across those two projects.
I would like to add maybe to this last point that we have Peel here from Denmark, and Denmark recently demonstrated a really great example of how the government worked with the communities and demonstrating what you said, the value. So next coffee break, maybe Peel can tell you more. But with that, I think I would like to thank Carl for your presentation and great remarks. It's great to have IEA with us here today. So round of applause for Carl. Thank you.